What happens when the most powerful woman in the room loses completely all control? Catherine Sterling, a billionaire logistics CEO who commanded boardrooms with a single icy glance, had spent 3 agonizing years and millions of dollars trying to hear just one word from her traumatized, mute daughter. Top neurologists at the best hospitals said it might never happen. But on a chaotic Tuesday afternoon, a scruffy, exhausted single father, a total stranger to Catherine, knelt down, wiped a tear from the little girl's cheek, and whispered a simple phrase. And then the impossible happened. The little girl opened her mouth and spoke. This isn't just a medical miracle. It's a collision of 2 shattered pasts, and the truth behind that stranger will leave you speechless. Catherine Sterling lived her life in sharp, uncompromising angles. As the CEO of Vanguard Global Logistics, a Fortune 500 powerhouse headquartered in a towering glass skyscraper in downtown Seattle, she was known by her competitors as the Iron Widow. She brokered billion-dollar shipping contracts before her morning espresso and dismantled corporate rivals with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. But inside her sprawling $20 million estate on Mercer Island, the iron melted into a profound, suffocating helplessness. Here, in the echoing halls of her mansion, Catherine wasn't a CEO. She was just a mother, failing her only child. Her 6-year-old daughter Chloe had not uttered a single syllable in exactly 1,104 days. The silence began on a rain-slicked afternoon on the Interstate 90 floating bridge. Catherine was supposed to be in the car. It was supposed to be a family trip to a cabin in Snoqualmie. But a last-minute hostile takeover bid had kept Catherine chained to her desk. Her husband, David, had taken Chloe ahead. A fatigued long-haul truck driver lost control, jackknifing across 3 lanes. David was killed instantly on impact. Chloe, strapped into her car seat in the back, was trapped in the mangled steel for 2 hours before first responders could cut her free. Chloe survived with barely a scratch, but the trauma had erected an impenetrable fortress around her mind. The official diagnosis from Dr. Penelope Hastings, the head of pediatric neurology at Seattle Children's Hospital, was psychogenic aphonia, profound selective mutism triggered by severe PTSD. Her vocal cords are perfectly healthy, Catherine, Dr. Hastings had explained gently during their 50th session. The paralysis is psychological. Chloe's brain has associated sound, specifically her own voice, with the terror of that day. Until she feels fundamentally, unequivocally safe, she will not speak. You cannot buy her voice back. That last sentence haunted Catherine. She could buy shipping fleets, politicians, and entire city blocks, but she couldn't buy a single word from her daughter. Every morning, Catherine would sit at the edge of Chloe's bed. Chloe was a beautiful child, with David's soft hazel eyes and Catherine's dark hair, but she moved through life like a ghost. She communicated through small nods, shakes of her head, and a tablet she kept strapped to her wrist. "Good morning, sweetheart," Catherine whispered, adjusting the collar of Chloe's private school uniform. Chloe looked up, her expression placid, and signed, "Good morning, Mama," in clumsy American Sign Language. Catherine's chest tightened. She forced a smile, kissing the top of the girl's head. "We have the big charity gala today, remember? You're going to sit at the special table with Uncle Robert. If it gets too loud, you just tap your tablet and Maria will take you to the quiet room." Chloe nodded once, her eyes dropping back to the floor. Catherine stood up, buttoning her tailored Tom Ford blazer, instantly shifting from a grieving mother back into the Iron Widow. She had an empire to run, a gala to host, and a broken heart to ignore. She didn't know that the foundation of her carefully controlled world was about to be ripped apart by a man who smelled of sawdust and cheap coffee. 20 miles away, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Renton, Thomas Reynolds was aggressively scrubbing a coffee stain out of his only decent flannel shirt. Thomas was 34, but the deep lines around his eyes made him look 10 years older. He was a master carpenter, a man who worked with his hands to turn raw timber into beautiful, functional things. But his hands couldn't fix the wreckage of his own life. 3 years ago, Thomas had been one of Seattle's most decorated paramedics. He thrived on the adrenaline, the desperate fight to pull people back from the brink of death. But a catastrophic call on the I-90 bridge had broken something fundamental inside him. He had crawled into a crushed SUV, held a screaming child while the jaws of life tore the metal apart, and watched a man bleed out right in front of him. The nightmares had been so severe, he had to surrender his badge. Shortly after, his wife, Sarah, lost her battle with aggressive ovarian cancer. Thomas was left entirely alone to raise their 7-year-old son, Noah. Noah was a brilliant, energetic boy, but he had severe dyslexia and required specialized, expensive tutoring that Thomas's carpentry income barely covered. That was why Thomas was currently stressing over a coffee stain. Today, he was working the biggest gig of his career. His small contracting company had been hired by a massive corporate event planner to build the staging, backdrops, and acoustic baffling for the Vanguard Global Logistics Charity Gala at the historic Fairmont Olympic Hotel. "Dad, I can't find my green dinosaur!" Noah yelled from the living room. Thomas sighed, abandoning the shirt and grabbing his tool belt. "It's in your backpack, buddy. Come on, we gotta go. Mrs. Higgins is waiting." After dropping Noah at his babysitter's house, Thomas drove his battered Ford F-150 into downtown Seattle. The Fairmont Olympic was a chaotic beehive of activity. Florists were hauling in thousands of white hydrangeas, lighting technicians were hanging massive crystal chandeliers, and event coordinators with clipboards were screaming into earpieces. Thomas ducked his head, focusing on his crew. They had to reinforce the main stage where the billionaire CEO, Catherine Sterling, was scheduled to give her keynote address. By 4 p.m., the grand ballroom was nearly finished, but the noise was deafening. Sound checks blasted through the speakers, drills whined, and people shouted over the din. Thomas, seeking a moment of peace, grabbed his thermos and slipped behind a heavy velvet curtain that led to a secluded, under-construction VIP alcove beneath the grand staircase. It was dark and quiet here, insulated from the chaos. Thomas sat on a wooden crate, unscrewed his thermos, and closed his eyes. Then he heard a sound. It wasn't a voice. It was a frantic, rhythmic tapping, accompanied by a soft, panicked wheezing. Thomas opened his eyes and grabbed his heavy Maglite flashlight. He clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the shadows under the stairs. Tucked into the furthest corner, huddled behind a stack of unused acoustic panels, was a little girl. She was dressed in a pristine, incredibly expensive-looking velvet dress, but she was trembling violently. Her hands were pressed tightly over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut, and she was hyperventilating, struggling to pull air into her small lungs. Thomas's old paramedic instincts instantly overrode his exhaustion. He recognized a severe panic attack when he saw one. The sensory overload of the ballroom had clearly terrified her. He moved slowly, deliberately making his footsteps heavy so he wouldn't startle her. He set his flashlight down so the beam bounced off the wall, providing a soft ambient glow rather than a harsh glare. "Hey there," Thomas said, keeping his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He stopped about 5 feet away and slowly sank to his knees, making himself smaller. "It's pretty loud out there, isn't it?" The little girl didn't answer. She opened her large, terrified hazel eyes and stared at him, shrinking further back against the wall. "I'm not going to hurt you," Thomas said softly. He noticed the expensive tablet strapped to her wrist, currently flashing a dead battery icon. He didn't ask where her parents were. He knew questions required cognitive processing, which was impossible during a panic attack. He just needed to ground her. He reached into his tool belt and pulled out a small block of smooth, sanded cedar wood he carried around to keep his hands busy. He rolled it between his calloused fingers. "You know, when my son gets scared of the thunder, I tell him a secret," Thomas murmured, not looking directly at her, letting her observe him without pressure. "I tell him that noise is just the sky rearranging its furniture. It's just big, clumsy clouds bumping into each other." The girl's hyperventilation slowed a fraction. She watched the block of wood in his hands. "You want to hold it?" Thomas asked, holding the wood out flat on his palm, like he was offering an apple to a frightened horse. "It smells like the forest." Slowly, hesitantly, the little girl uncurled one hand from her ear. She reached out, her small, trembling fingers brushing against his rough, scarred palm. She took the wooden block and brought it to her nose. Thomas smiled, a sad, gentle smile. "My name is Thomas. What's yours?" The girl looked at him, opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Not a squeak, not a breath. A look of profound frustration and sorrow washed over her small face, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. Thomas immediately understood. He had seen this before in trauma victims. "She can't speak." Hey, it's okay," Thomas said quickly, shuffling a little closer. He didn't touch her, but he leaned in, his voice dropping to a soothing, familiar rhythm that he used to use in the back of the ambulance. It was a cadence he hadn't used in 3 years. He looked into her hazel eyes, and a strange jolt went through him. A ghost of a memory flickered in the back of his mind: rain, blood, crushed metal, and hazel eyes, but he pushed it away. This wasn't the time for his own ghosts. "It's all right, little bird," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with unfeigned empathy. "The storm is passing. Just look at the stars." "What do you mean you can't find her?" Catherine Sterling's voice cut through the clamor of the ballroom like a scythe. She was standing near the entrance, her face pale, her perfectly manicured hands gripped into tight fists. Robert Gaines, her burly head of security, looked genuinely panicked. "Miss Sterling," Maria turned her back for 30 seconds to grab Chloe's noise-canceling headphones. When she turned around, Chloe was gone. "We have all exits secured. She hasn't left the building." "She is 6 years old, Robert. She is mute. If she's hurt or trapped, she cannot cry out for help." Catherine's composure was disintegrating. The Iron Widow was gone, replaced entirely by a terrified mother reliving her worst nightmare. "Lock down the hotel. Nobody leaves. Tear this place apart." Catherine didn't wait for him to execute the order. She hiked up her designer skirt and began sprinting through the ballroom, ignoring the shocked stares of the event staff. "Chloe!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Chloe!" She checked the bathrooms, the catering kitchens, behind the heavy drapes. Panic, cold and sharp, was clawing up her throat. The noise in the ballroom, the drilling, the music, was exactly the kind of sensory assault that triggered Chloe's worst episodes. Catherine found herself near the grand staircase. She noticed a heavy velvet curtain slightly pulled back, revealing the dark, unfinished storage space beneath the stairs. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She practically ripped the curtain aside, stepping into the dim light. And then she froze. About 10 feet away, sitting on the dusty concrete floor, was a man in a faded flannel shirt and a tool belt. He was kneeling on the ground, and sitting directly in front of him, her tiny hands clutching a block of wood, was Chloe. Catherine's immediate instinct was maternal rage. A strange man had her daughter cornered in the dark. She opened her mouth to scream for security, to physically throw herself at the man. But then she saw Chloe's face. Chloe wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. She was staring up at the man with an expression of intense, almost hypnotic focus. Catherine stepped forward, her expensive heels clicking loudly on the concrete. The man, Thomas, looked up, startled. "Oh, hey, are you her mother?" She got spooked by the noise. Catherine didn't look at him. She dropped to her knees, her $10,000 Birkin bag sliding off her shoulder and hitting the dust with a dull thud. She reached for her daughter, Chloe. "Oh my God, baby, are you okay?" Chloe didn't look at her mother. Her hazel eyes remained locked on the carpenter. Her small chest was heaving, not with panic, but with a monumental internal struggle. Her little hands gripped the block of wood so tightly, her knuckles were white. "Chloe?" Catherine asked, her voice trembling, sensing the heavy, electric tension in the air. Chloe took a deep, shuddering breath. Her lips parted, her throat muscles tightened, vibrating with a visible effort that seemed to cause her physical pain. Thomas watched her, holding his breath, recognizing the monumental wall the child was trying to break through. He didn't know why, but he felt a tear prick his own eye. "It's okay," Thomas whispered to the girl, unconsciously repeating the cadence. "The storm is passing." Chloe's mouth moved. A harsh, raspy sound like 2 dry leaves rubbing together escaped her throat. It was the sound of vocal cords that had been locked in a psychological paralysis for over 3 years, suddenly forcing themselves to work. Catherine stopped breathing entirely. The world around her ceased to exist. Chloe looked right into Thomas's eyes, and in a voice that was hoarse, tiny, but undeniably clear, she spoke. "Say it again." The silence that followed was louder than a bomb. Catherine collapsed backward onto her hands, her mouth falling open in a silent scream of shock. She stared at her daughter, her brain entirely failing to process the reality of what just happened. She spoke. My baby spoke. Thomas sat frozen, the blood draining from his face. The moment the child's raspy voice hit his ears, a violent flashback slammed into his consciousness. 3 years ago, the crushed SUV on the I-90 bridge, the smell of gasoline and copper. He was wedged in the back seat, holding a terrified, blood-spattered little girl while the jaws of life ripped the roof off. To keep her from going into shock, to keep her from hearing the dying sounds of the man in the front seat, he had buried her face in his chest and sung a lullaby his late wife used to sing. "It's all right, little bird," he had chanted in the dark, bloody rain. "The storm is passing. Just look at the stars." Thomas looked at the billionaire woman sobbing on the floor, and then down at the little girl holding his piece of cedar wood. "Dear God," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking, "it's you." Catherine, tears streaming down her face, looked up at the scruffy carpenter. Her mind was racing, trying to connect the impossible dots. Why did her daughter, who had remained silent in front of the world's best doctors, just speak to a random construction worker? "Who?" Catherine choked out, her entire body shaking violently. "Who are you?" Thomas slowly stood up, backing away, completely overwhelmed by the ghosts of his past resurrecting in front of him. I have to go." Before Catherine could stop him, before she could demand answers, Thomas turned and bolted out from under the staircase, disappearing into the chaotic sea of the ballroom, leaving the CEO on the floor with a daughter who had finally found her voice. For a full minute after the scruffy carpenter disappeared into the sprawling chaos of the Fairmont Olympic Ballroom, Catherine Sterling remained frozen on the dusty concrete floor beneath the stairs. She was gripping her daughter's shoulders as if letting go would cause the universe to unravel. Chloe's chest was rising and falling in an exhausted, rhythmic slumber. The sheer, monumental effort of breaking through 3 years of psychological paralysis, of forcing air through dormant vocal cords to speak 3 single words, had entirely depleted the 6-year-old's energy. She had slumped forward against Catherine's chest, her small hands still locked in a death grip around the smooth cedar block the stranger had given her. "Chloe," Catherine whispered, her voice cracking, pressing her face into her daughter's dark hair. She waited, half expecting the raspy voice to return, but Chloe was deeply asleep. "Ms. Sterling?" Robert Gaines, the hulking head of Vanguard's corporate security, burst through the velvet curtain, his hand resting instinctively on his holstered radio. When he saw his billionaire boss sitting in the dirt, weeping, his face dropped. "Catherine." "Is she?" "She spoke, Robert," Catherine gasped, looking up with wild, tear-streaked eyes. The Iron Widow was completely shattered, leaving only a mother reeling from a miracle. She spoke. "My baby spoke." Robert knelt immediately, his professional demeanor slipping into genuine astonishment. "What? Are you sure? What did she say?" "She said 3 words to a man." Catherine's tone suddenly shifted, the raw, emotional vulnerability hardening into a fierce, laser-focused intensity. She gently gathered Chloe into her arms, standing up with a monumental effort, ignoring the dust covering her designer skirt. A carpenter, faded red flannel, brown hair, maybe mid-30s. He was working on the staging. "He ran out of here 2 minutes ago." Robert frowned, instantly calculating. "I'll have the perimeter locked down. I'll pull the contractor manifests." "I don't care about the gala," Catherine snapped, her voice regaining its boardroom authority. "Cancel my speech. Have the VP of marketing take over. Get my car to the loading dock right now." "And Robert?" Robert paused, holding the velvet curtain open. "Yes, ma'am?" "Find out exactly who that man is. I want his name, his address, his entire life history on my desk by the time I get Chloe home and put her in bed. Do not fail me on this." 30 miles south, in the rain-battered suburb of Renton, Thomas Reynolds was violently pacing the length of his cramped living room. He had practically sprinted out of the hotel, abandoning his tools and his crew, driving his battered Ford F-150 recklessly through the slick Seattle traffic until he reached his babysitter's house to pick up Noah. Now, his 7-year-old son was sitting on the worn-out sofa, coloring a picture of a spaceship, blissfully unaware that his father's mind was currently trapped in a horrific loop of the past. Thomas gripped the edges of the kitchen counter, his knuckles white, staring blankly at the dripping faucet. "Say it again." The little girl's hoarse, fragile voice echoed in his skull like a physical blow. For 3 years, Thomas had fought a brutal, agonizing war against his own memory. He had surrendered his paramedic badge, abandoned a career he loved, and buried himself in sawdust and blueprints just to escape the ghosts of Interstate 90. He had convinced himself that the past was dead. But it wasn't dead. It was sitting in a velvet dress under a staircase, holding his block of cedar wood. The sound of her voice had violently ripped the scab off his deepest psychological wound. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the flashback was absolute and unforgiving. He was back on the bridge. The torrential rain stinging his face, the sickening crunch of steel, the smell of leaking antifreeze and arterial blood. He remembered crawling through the shattered back window of the crushed SUV. He remembered the driver, a man with kind hazel eyes pinned fatally against the steering column, his breathing ragged and wet. And he remembered the little girl in the back seat, paralyzed with terror, her eyes wide as saucers as she stared at the horrific scene unfolding inches away from her. To protect her, to keep her from absorbing the trauma of her father's violent, fading breaths, Thomas had pulled her tiny face into his chest. He had covered her ears with his heavy gloved hands, blocking out the sirens, the grinding metal, and the dying gasps of her father. He had rocked her back and forth in the dark, bloody wreckage, desperately chanting the only thing he could think of, the lullaby his late wife, Sarah, used to sing to Noah during thunderstorms. "It's all right, little bird. The storm is passing. Just look at the stars." Thomas opened his eyes, gasping for air in his kitchen. A tear slid down his rough cheek. She remembered. The little girl from the bridge had remembered the exact cadence of his voice. She had remembered the words that had served as her only anchor in the worst moment of her life. "Dad?" Thomas jolted, turning around. Noah was looking at him, a green crayon paused over his paper. "Are you crying?" Thomas quickly wiped his face with the back of his flannel sleeve, forcing a tight, unconvincing smile. "No, buddy. Just got some sawdust in my eye at work today. You hungry? Want me to make some mac and cheese?" Before Noah could answer, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed on the apartment door. Thomas froze. It was 9 p.m. No one visited them at this hour. He walked slowly to the door, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked through the peephole. Standing in the dimly lit, dingy hallway of his apartment complex was Catherine Sterling. She was flanked by a massive man in a tailored suit, but she stood front and center, an imposing silhouette of wealth and desperate determination amidst the peeling paint of the corridor. Thomas closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping in defeat. You can't outrun a billionaire, and you certainly can't outrun a mother. He turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Catherine stood there, the collar of her expensive trench coat turned up against the damp cold. The sharp, intimidating facade of the Iron Widow was completely gone. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her hands were trembling. "Mr. Reynolds," Catherine said, her voice remarkably soft, devoid of any corporate command. She looked past him, briefly glancing at the modest, cluttered apartment, noting the stack of overdue bills on the entry table, and Noah peeking around the sofa. "Miss Sterling," Thomas replied quietly, leaning against the doorframe, a posture of utter exhaustion. "I'm sorry I left the job site. I'll forfeit the payment." "I don't care about the staging," Catherine said, stepping slightly closer. Robert, her security chief, remained silent behind her. "My head of security ran a background check on the contracting company. It took him 20 minutes to find out that before you were a carpenter, you were a senior paramedic for King County. You were stationed at Station 42. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He didn't say anything. Catherine's breath hitched, fresh wave of tears threatening to spill. Station 42 was the first responder unit dispatched to the Interstate 90 floating bridge 3 years ago. The collision involving a commercial truck and a black Range Rover. "Miss Sterling, please," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking, darting a protective glance back at Noah. "Not here. Not in front of my son." Catherine immediately understood. She nodded, her composure hanging by a thread. She turned to Robert. "Wait in the car." Robert hesitated. Catherine, protocol. "Wait in the car, Robert," she commanded, the steel briefly returning to her tone. She looked back at Thomas. "Can we talk? Please." I have spent 3 years and a fortune in medical bills trying to understand my daughter's silence. And today, she broke it for you. I need to know why. Thomas stepped back, opening the door wider. "Noah, buddy, go put your headphones on and watch a show in your room for a little bit, okay? Dad needs to talk to this lady about work." Noah nodded, grabbing his tablet and bounding down the short hallway. Once the bedroom door clicked shut, the silence in the living room became suffocating. Catherine stepped inside, looking entirely out of place in her tailored designer clothes amid the thrift store furniture and scattered children's toys. She didn't sit down. She turned to face Thomas, her hazel eyes, the exact same eyes as Chloe's, boring into him. "It was you," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "Dr. Hastings, her neurologist, always said Chloe was locked in a psychological fortress." She associated her own voice with the trauma of that day. She was waiting for a sign that she was fundamentally safe. Catherine took a shaky breath. "You were in the car with them, weren't you?" Thomas walked into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter again, putting physical distance between them. He stared out the window into the rainy night. "I was the first one in the vehicle," Thomas said, his voice flat, hollow, devoid of emotion, as a defense mechanism against the rising panic. "Your husband, David." He was in the driver's seat. The dashboard had collapsed inward. The engine block was in his lap. Catherine gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, tears freely spilling down her cheeks. She had read the clinical police reports, but hearing it from the man who was there was entirely different. "He was conscious when I got in," Thomas continued, forcing the words out, determined to give this woman the closure she was owed, even if it tore him apart. He was in immense pain, but his only concern was the back seat. He kept turning his head, coughing up blood, looking at her, at Chloe. "What? What did he say?" Catherine sobbed, her knees buckling slightly, forcing her to lean against the armrest of the worn sofa. Thomas turned around to face her, his own eyes brimming with unshed tears. He looked at me, grabbed my jacket, and said, "Tell my wife I love her more than life. And please, God, save my little girl. Don't let her see this." Catherine let out a broken, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands. The pristine CEO was entirely broken down, mourning the husband she lost and the terror her daughter had endured. Thomas walked over slowly, keeping a respectful distance, his heart aching with a profound shared grief. "I couldn't save him, Miss Sterling. His injuries were catastrophic. He passed away a minute later. But Chloe was awake. She was screaming, not making a sound, just a silent, terrified scream, and she was staring right at her father. Thomas took a deep breath, the phantom smell of blood filling his nose. "I promised your husband I wouldn't let her see, so I crawled into the back seat. I pulled her into my chest. I covered her eyes, and I pressed my hands hard over her ears so she wouldn't hear the sound of the jaws of life tearing the car apart. I held her in the dark for 2 hours while they cut us out." Catherine looked up, her makeup ruined, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. She was trapped in the dark with you. You were her only anchor. Thomas nodded slowly. She was hyperventilating, going into shock. I had to keep her grounded. So, I put my mouth right next to her ear, between my fingers, and I repeated a lullaby my wife used to sing to our son. Over and over again, for 2 hours. "It's all right, little bird. The storm is passing. Just look at the stars." The room fell deadly silent, save for the sound of rain lashing against the thin apartment windows. Catherine finally understood. The missing puzzle piece that had baffled the world's greatest pediatric neurologists suddenly snapped into terrifying, beautiful clarity. Chloe hadn't just associated sound with trauma. She had associated one specific voice with absolute, unconditional safety in the midst of hell. When Thomas knelt down beneath the staircase at the gala and unconsciously used the exact same words, with the exact same gravelly, soothing cadence, he had effectively reached back in time and unlocked the door to Chloe's psychological fortress. "She recognized you," Catherine breathed, awe and profound gratitude washing over her grief. "She didn't speak today because she was finally healed. She spoke today because she was asking you to save her again." "Say it again," She wanted you to give her the anchor. Thomas scrubbed his face with his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. After that night, I couldn't do it anymore. I started having panic attacks every time I heard a siren. My wife passed away from cancer shortly after, and my son. He gestured toward the hallway. Noah has severe dyslexia. He needs me. I couldn't be a broken paramedic for him. So I quit. I thought I failed your family, Miss Sterling. I thought I failed your husband. Catherine stood up tall. The billionaire CEO was gone. In her place stood a fiercely protective, fiercely grateful mother. She walked over to Thomas, completely ignoring the boundaries of wealth and status, and wrapped her arms around the stunned carpenter in a tight, desperate embrace. You didn't fail us, Thomas, Catherine whispered fiercely into his shoulder, crying freely. You stood in the gates of hell and shielded my daughter's soul. You sacrificed your own peace of mind to protect her. You are the reason she is still here. You are the reason she spoke. Thomas, overwhelmed, slowly brought his arms up and returned the embrace. 3 years of suffocating survivor's guilt finally beginning to fracture and release. The following weeks fundamentally altered the trajectory of both families, blurring the lines between the towering glass skyscrapers of Vanguard Global Logistics and the modest, sawdust-covered world of Reynolds Restorations. Catherine Sterling did not offer Thomas money. She was smart enough and possessed enough emotional intelligence to know that offering a proud, traumatized man a blank check for saving her daughter's life would be an insult to his character. Instead, she offered something far more valuable, a permanent, undeniable integration of their lives and the resources to heal the wounds that had been festering in the dark. It started slowly. 2 days after the gala, Catherine invited Thomas and Noah to her sprawling Mercer Island estate. It was a Saturday afternoon, the sun breaking through the perpetual Seattle clouds, casting a golden hue over the manicured lawns. Thomas arrived in his truck, acutely aware of the contrast between his scuffed boots and the pristine marble foyer. Noah, however, was oblivious to the wealth. He immediately sprinted toward the massive backyard, his eyes fixed on a sprawling, custom-built wooden playset. Catherine stood on the patio, holding Chloe's hand. The little girl was clutching the smooth cedar block Thomas had given her. She hadn't spoken since the gala, but Dr. Hastings, the neurologist, had been ecstatic. The psychological dam had cracked. It was only a matter of time before it broke completely. Thomas walked up the patio steps, his hands shoved nervously into his pockets. Beautiful place you have here. Catherine smiled, a genuine, warm expression that her corporate rivals had never seen. Thank you. Chloe, do you remember Thomas? Chloe looked up. She didn't shrink away. She stepped forward, releasing her mother's hand, and walked right up to the tall carpenter. She looked at his hands, then held up the cedar block. Thomas sank to one knee, putting himself at her eye level. He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. You kept it. That's a good piece of wood. Keeps the monsters away. Chloe stared at him intensely. Her chest heaved once. Her throat worked, the muscles straining against the psychological barrier. Thumb, as Chloe rasped, her voice tiny and fragile, but unmistakable. Catherine gasped, pressing her hand over her mouth, tears instantly springing to her eyes. It was the second time she had spoken in 3 years. Thomas's smile widened, a profound warmth flooding his chest. That's right, little bird. That's my name. From that day forward, an unconventional, beautiful rhythm established itself. Thomas became a fixture at the Mercer Island estate. Catherine, using her vast network of resources, didn't just throw money at Noah's dyslexia. She brought in the nation's top educational specialists. They worked with Noah in the estate's sprawling library, turning learning into a game that Noah suddenly thrived on. In return, Thomas provided something Catherine couldn't buy: grounding. He built a custom, soundproof treehouse for Chloe in the massive oak tree in the backyard. It was a safe haven, smelling of fresh pine and cedar, insulated from the sensory overload of the world. He would sit in the treehouse with Chloe for hours, carving small wooden animals while she painted them. He never pressured her to speak. He simply existed with her, a quiet, steady presence that reinforced the feeling of absolute safety he had given her in the wrecked car. And slowly, beautifully, the silence shattered. It started with single words. Wood, paint, bird, then short sentences. By the time 6 months had passed, Chloe's raspy voice had smoothed out, replaced by the melodic, energetic chatter of a normal 6-year-old girl. She laughed. She argued with Noah over who got to use the blue paint. She ran through the halls of the mansion, filling the echoing silence with life. But the healing wasn't one-sided. One evening in late October, the rain lashing against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of Catherine's study, Thomas found himself sitting in a leather armchair across from the CEO. The fire roared in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. Thomas was holding a glass of scotch, staring into the amber liquid. He looked healthier. The dark circles under his eyes had faded, and the perpetual tension in his shoulders had loosened. "I have a proposition for you," Catherine said, setting her own glass down on the mahogany desk. She slid a thick, bound folder across the surface. Thomas leaned forward, raising an eyebrow. "I already told you, Catherine, I'm not letting you pay for my truck's transmission." Catherine laughed softly. "This isn't about your truck, Thomas. Open it." Thomas picked up the folder and flipped it open. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate contract. The letterhead read, Vanguard Global Logistics, Charitable Foundation. "I'm launching a new philanthropic division of Vanguard," Catherine explained, her eyes shining with purpose. "We are going to build trauma recovery centers for children involved in severe accidents across the Pacific Northwest. Safe spaces, soundproof rooms, environments designed to heal the mind, not just the body." Thomas looked at the blueprints attached to the contract. They were beautiful, intricate designs favoring natural wood, soft lighting, and acoustic insulation. "I want Reynolds Restorations to be the exclusive general contractor for every single facility," Catherine said, leaning forward, her gaze intense and sincere. "I don't just want a builder, Thomas. I want a man who understands exactly what a child needs when the world becomes too loud. I want a man who knows how to build a fortress." Thomas stared at the contract. The numbers on the page were staggering. It would take his small, struggling carpentry business and turn it into a regional powerhouse. It would secure Noah's future forever. But more than the money, it gave him a profound, meaningful purpose. It was a way to take the trauma of Interstate 90 and forge it into a shield for others. He looked up at Catherine, his vision blurring slightly with emotion. "Catherine, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Catherine whispered, smiling. "Say yes, so we can finally put the ghosts to rest." Thomas looked down at the blueprints, tracing a line of a proposed therapy room with his calloused thumb. He thought about the crushed SUV. He thought about the agonizing years of silence. And then he heard the sound of laughter echoing from the hallway, Chloe and Noah chasing each other toward the kitchen. The storm had finally passed. Thomas closed the folder, looked at the woman who had brought his life back from the brink, and smiled. Yes, sometimes the universe breaks us in ways that seem entirely unfixable, only to send our healing in the most unexpected of disguises. Catherine Sterling possessed all the power in the world, yet it took a broken, scruffy carpenter with a haunted past to unlock the prison of her daughter's mind. Thomas Reynolds thought his life was defined by the lives he couldn't save, only to discover that the seed of salvation he planted in a dark, wrecked car had blossomed into his own redemption 3 years later. Their story is a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't found in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the profound, healing power of human connection, empathy, and the courage to face our deepest traumas together. If this story of miraculous healing and unexpected destiny touched your heart, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the storm always passes, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of the human spirit. Let us know in the comments below, who is the stranger in your life that changed everything?